Hello, everyone, and thanks to the conference organizers for inviting me to present today. I'm presenting on behalf of an international group of investigators. We're known as Study Nexus, the Needle Exchange Uptake Study. That's as creative as I can get. These are my conflicts of interest. So I can talk about this subject for many hours, and unfortunately we have very limited time today. But at the end of 2023, only 9 countries had prison needle and syringe programs in at least one of their prisons. Canada was among one of these 9 countries. At the end of 2024, that number expanded to 11 to include Iran and North Macedonia. But really, over the last 30 years, there has been very little expansion of prison needle and syringe programs. So the first prison needle and syringe program was implemented in Switzerland in 1992. We came on board in 2018, and you can see that PNSP availability varies considerably, with Spain and Luxembourg and even Kyrgyzstan offering prison needle and syringe programs in every single prison. However, Tajikistan only a third, Canada a dismal 6%, and Ukraine, believe it or not, despite being in a full-fledged war, came on board in 2023 and already has needle and syringe programs in at least two of their prisons. Our prison needle and syringe programs are in our Canadian federal prison system. For those who don't know, these are prisons where individuals are incarcerated or sentenced for greater than or equal to 2 years. There are approximately 12,400 individuals across the 43 prisons. With many carceral settings worldwide, there's an overrepresentation of visible minorities, Indigenous men and women, representing 32% and 40% of the incarcerated federal population, but only 5% of the Canadian population, and men and women who inject drugs, consisting of 21% and 30% of the federal population, but less than 1% of the Canadian population. Correctional Service Canada, or CSC, oversees healthcare delivery, and most recent statistics by CSC has shown an HCV antibody prevalence of 22%, higher among women, 32% versus 21%. This means, compared to 1% in the general population, this means that any country, especially Canada, but really any country's attempt to eliminate hepatitis C must focus on carceral settings. How does our program work? Like most countries, it is delivered through prison healthcare. The kit, which is in my bag, I forgot to bring it up, but if anyone's interested, the kit is exchanged 1-for-1 during working hours at healthcare. There are twice daily visual inspections, so it counts in the morning and in the afternoon, where correctional officers come by to an individual cell to ensure that the kit is where it should be located. Individuals sign a contract stating that they shall not share their equipment with anyone outside of themselves. Also, correctional officers are expected to not sign a contract, but behave within an expectation that they will not increase their searches, observations of individuals who participate, leading to increased disciplinary action. And participation is dependent on a threat and risk assessment, which I'll describe shortly. But the kit itself, as you can see here, is a plastic container. There's one sterile needle, there's a cooker, there's a blister pack of cotton filters, ascorbic or vitamin C, and an ampule of sterile water for clean injection. So this is the threat and risk assessment. It's truly convoluted and unnecessary in my opinion. No other country in the world has a risk assessment to ensure that an individual's participation will not result in increased security concern for individuals in prison. The threat and risk assessment in Canada starts with an individual making that request, going to healthcare. Healthcare then takes the request and sends it to the Assistant Warden of Operations. The AWO then seeks input from the SIO, the Security Intelligence Officer. The SIO then informs the AWO, the Assistant Warden, what he or she thinks, and then the Assistant Warden goes to the Warden for that sign-off. This is a process, and while it should only take 10 business days to approve, which some may argue is ludicrously long, we have heard from participants that the process can take up to 3 months. And what's really disappointing, and what was at the heart of why I chose to go into this, is that in a 4-year period, 25% of all applications were declined due to security concerns. And so uptake, unfortunately, remains problematic around the country. So there are 9 federal prisons that have prison needle exchange program. Female prisons were preferentially selected due to a higher prevalence of injection drug use. But a back-of-the-envelope calculation revealed that only 9% of people who inject drugs in prisons were accessing the program at the end of November. And unfortunately, 3 prisons had yet to enroll a single participant in the 5 years that this program has been functioning. And so with that, we had to do something. And so we sought to explore the barriers and facilitators to improving PNEP, they call it Prison Needle Exchange Program by CSC in the federal system, for people who inject drugs in prison among key carceral stakeholder groups. This was the first time it was done in Canada in the federal prisons, using as many stakeholder groups: correctional officers who oversee the program, healthcare workers who deliver the program, current and or potential PNEP users, participants of the program, and peer advocates, i.e. individuals who are considered trusted and to whom other people in prison go to for advice. We used a technique called nominal group technique, which is a rapid mixed method strategy that promotes group participation in the decision-making process. You can imagine this is particularly relevant for carceral settings where there are certain hierarchies that exist. It's a 4-step process. The first is silent generation of ideas. So you ask a question and you give individuals time to either write them down or think of them. And then you go around the circle one by one, and individuals are asked to provide an answer, only one at a time, until all ideas are exhausted. Afterwards, ideas are clarified such that if there's any overlap in ideas, they're amalgamated. And finally, people get to vote. Everyone gets 3 votes. You can split your votes however you want. If you really believe that X is a barrier, you can place all your votes on that one barrier. If you're sort of straddling between X, Y, and Z, you can put your votes 1, 1, and 1. And so we asked every stakeholder group 2 questions. The first is, what gets in the way of people in your prison from using the Prison Needle Exchange Program? We went through the 4 steps. Once we had the top answers to question 1, we then said, based on your top answers, what could be done to get more people in prison to use the Prison Needle Exchange Program? And so we adapted the socio-ecological model, which many of you have probably used, by McElroy, to understand perceived barriers and solutions to PNEP uptake. Socio-ecological systems theory demonstrates the nested and interdependent nature of human development and interactions at the personal level, the relational and collective levels. So the SEM was developed recognizing that individuals affect and are affected by a complex range of social influences and environmental interactions. It involves 5 spheres of influence: individual, interpersonal, organizational, community in the original version, and policy. For this research, we adapted the SEM to reflect both the Prison Needle Exchange Program and the existing hierarchy in carceral settings. So we have individuals' personal knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs; interrelational, individuals' relationships with other peers, healthcare workers, correctional officers; organizational, anything related to the program itself; system, those prison leaders, the wardens, the AWOs; and then structural or policy, so CSC's PNEP policies. So in a whirlwind tour of the country in 4 months, this was probably my favorite time, in 2023 and 2024, we completed 34 focus groups. And as you can see, we were able to complete, 9 times 4 is 36, so we were missing 2 focus groups. Why is that? It's because 2 correctional officer groups declined participation because they were mandated to do so by the Union of Canadian Correctional Officers. So shy of those 2 correctional groups, we had 51 correctional officers, 67 healthcare workers, and 97 people in prison. For those who are interested in the technique, the ideal size for nominal group technique is actually between 8 and 10. You can see we had groups as small as 2, but when you present at a prison, you take what you can get on that day. Compensation, we were not allowed to compensate anyone because individuals were participating during working hours for employees, and there is a rule that I'm working very hard to change at CSC whereby people in prison cannot be compensated for research at the federal level. So this is what NGT looks like in real life. This is me at the Atlantic Institution in November 2023. I had 7 peer advocates, and I use words that they want to use. So people in prison is what researchers often use. They wanted to be called inmates. So what gets in the way of inmates using the needle exchange program? You can see they gave me 17 answers, and at the end, they voted on stigma from friends and stigma from staff being the top responses. Using those as the top responses, we then asked, based on these responses, what could or should be done to get more inmates on the needle exchange program. Again, they get creative, and you ask them to think outside the box, and you use their words when you jot the answers down, and you can see number 8, create safe injection sites, was the clear winner here. So for this research, we wanted to rank the highest ranking barriers among all stakeholders. The top 3 answers, as you can see here, one is lack of confidentiality or privacy, and you can see the different ways that the groups ranked these. So this was particularly important for healthcare workers who recognized that when they submitted a TRA, that TRA went to all prison leadership, and correctional officers were made aware of the program participation, which resulted in checks. And so healthcare workers were particularly plagued by the lack of privacy and confidentiality, as were people in prison, ranking it number 2. The second highest barrier was fear of repercussions due to drug use. This was ranked number 1 by people in prison, and less high up on the list for other individuals, but they really talked about a catch-22 of participation, whereby they're given the tools to inject, but then denied the liberties to use the equipment provided. And it resulted in removal of privileges, changes to security classification, and effect parole. And the third biggest barrier was fear of being targeted. Individuals often spoke about increased urinalyses that are actually not so random, increased cell searches. Participation brought unwanted attention to individuals who even were sharing a living space. And in fact, a lot of participants spoke about the preference to share equipment rather than become a participant of the program because of this fear of being targeted. When you categorize the barriers along the socio-ecological model, the thing that I want to bring your attention to is that it's all clustered, primarily, let's say, around individual and interpersonal. And so the individual is feeling the fear of being targeted, fear of repercussions, but it's enacted actually at the interpersonal level by correctional officers. The bullying that they fear to share equipment and or use drugs, that is enacted by peers at the interpersonal level. So oftentimes there is this dual function between individual and interpersonal. At the system level and organizational level, the long and complex application process was an important barrier that was highlighted. Similarly, if you look at highest ranking solutions, education across the board was an important solution. Targeted education, not only towards correctional officers, but a lot of people didn't even know the program existed. And healthcare workers, despite what you would believe are proponents of program, do not understand the basic pathophysiology of addiction or the importance of harm reduction. The second highest ranking solution, ranked number 1 by correctional officers, supervised or safe injection site, lower for healthcare workers and people in prison, but they really felt, correctional officer, that it solved many of the problems. It particularly made their job safer because they didn't have to worry about any needle stick injuries, but it also resulted in decreased peer pressure, it could result in decreased peer pressure, decreased targeting, and fear of repercussions. And external program delivery, so in Moldova and actually the Ukraine, they have a peer model program where individuals provide needle and syringes to individuals in prison. You can see that correctional officers, not at all were they interested in having an external program delivery. Isn't that ironic? They want to be part of the program, control, ensure that it's secure. But people in prison, it was their number 1 solution. They spoke about having peers, having dispensing machines, which you have in Germany or parts of Switzerland. And some even recognize that, okay, healthcare could be important, but how do we do it in a way that still remains confidential is still yet to be borne out. What I want to bring your attention to here is, unlike individual and interpersonal, where all the barriers, most of the barriers were clustered, here they're clustered primarily at the organizational and the policy level. Education spans it all, but really organizational changes to PNEP, automatic enrollment, wraparound services to help recovery and rehabilitation, and improved confidentiality, with the structural policy changes that I mentioned before, supervised injection site and external program delivery. So to conclude, the socio-ecological model provides a framework for identifying barriers and prioritizing solutions to guide implementation. While most barriers to PNEP were clustered at the individual interpersonal level, no standalone solution was proposed at these levels, suggesting that prison-based interpersonal relationships are actually quite challenging to address. Conversely, proposed solutions focus primarily on organizational and or structural modifications to the delivery of PNEP, with the advantage of having secondary benefits on interpersonal relationships. There was significant overlap in responses between stakeholder groups, particularly for their solutions. And by organizing the barriers by ranking across distinct spheres of influence, targeted interventions at each unique site can be facilitated to ensure sustainability. So we've had a productive year, and for those who are interested in this work, we've published 2 companion papers, one focused solely on correctional officers and healthcare workers, and the other focused on people in prison. We've also been fortunate enough to publish a viewpoint in the Lancet Public Health that looks at some of the implementation barriers at a global level. And very proud to, I've presented this work last year, actually. If you remember, some of you, the cost-benefit analysis of Canada's prison needle exchange program was published at CMAG at the end of November, whereby we showed that it was a cost-saving program. For every dollar we spent, we actually got 2 back. And so we made the national news. I never knew when this would happen in my lifetime, if ever. So on December 18th, my dad, took a picture of me on the front page of the Globe and Mail, and where it said, every dollar spent on prison needle exchange program saves correctional system $2 in healthcare costs. I think this is so important, especially if our government does change. And not quite good at media, but made it on CBC News. And some wise woman was quoted to say, "We should take it upon ourselves to be leaders in this sphere. The lack of improvement, to me, is indicative of a program that exists by name alone and not for the desire to perform at its best." And I think right now it's particularly important. We all have voices now more than ever, as our American colleagues or friends are being silenced for the incredible work that they do. We need to stand up for science and for what we believe in. So with that, thank you so much.